This is a Global Original Podcast.
Coronavirus, your questions answered. With Nick Ferrari at Breakfast, a podcast from LBC.
Disturbing front page headline for the Daily Telegraph. Immunity to COVID-19 may only last a matter of months. Or, as they've put here, a matter of months. Who subbed page one yesterday, guys? According to research that could hinder the rollout of a successful vaccine, the study by Imperial College London involved 365,000 people, found antibodies in the population fell by more than a quarter in 3 months. Scientists say these findings suggest a rapid decline in immunity, which could mean that, and I'm sorry to give you gloomy news, even if a successful vaccine were to be found, it might have to be administered sometimes twice a year. Well, let's turn to, and by the way, this means that you might not have had it once, you might have actually had it twice. Let's turn to Dr. Chris Smith, who helped us through the very dark days, the early days of COVID, was one of our panel of experts in Ask the Experts, with your questions answered. Dr. Chris Smith is, of course, consultant virologist at Cambridge University Hospital, a broadcaster as well. I know I can just throw you the headline and you'll run with it. Immunity lasts a few months, Chris.
Hello, Nick. Yeah, this is the REACT-2 study. As you say, looked at 365,000 people using finger prick tests. These are tests sent out to people. You prick your finger. It's taking a small droplet of blood. In the blood are antibodies to everything you've ever met in your life or been vaccinated against, so we can use those antibodies as a marker of who's been exposed, who's immune to things. When they did this study in June, they found that about 6% of people they'd mailed it to tested positive. That's now 4%. So in other words, there's been about a 25% reduction in the number of people who have detectable antibodies against the coronavirus. Now, that's not because the people have disappeared. It is because the antibody level in the blood has dropped below the level at which that test can detect them. That sounds like bad news, and you might think, well, does this mean we're now vulnerable again? It could mean that. On the other hand, we know that antibody titers, the levels of antibody in the blood, are not static. They do fall with time, but that doesn't mean they've completely gone away, and it doesn't mean that the immune memory under there has completely gone away. You have a memory of all the things you've encountered in your lifetime. When you meet that threat again, you can rekindle that immune response and very quickly boot up a response which is far ahead of where you would be had you never met that threat. So while you might become vulnerable again, it's likely you wouldn't actually catch it as badly the next time, although that's not a given either. And it's also possible that although the antibody titers have fallen below a detectable level, it doesn't automatically mean the person is susceptible at all.
Let me ask you, Chris, for experts in the field, and indeed you are one, what do you and your colleagues have to do next then, armed with this information?
Well, obviously people are going to say, well, what's the verdict for a vaccine? Because if we can't make long-term demonstrable responses, having caught the virus for real, what hope does a vaccine stand? Well, actually, it's not quite as sombre as that, because actually vaccines anticipate that viruses have tricks up their sleeves that mean that your immune system doesn't make a very good response. That's how viruses work. They encode various mechanisms that thwart your immune response and make it less good. A vaccine is unencumbered in that way. A vaccine is designed to really whip your immune system a real good kick up the backside and make a very, very good response. So it is not a death knell to a vaccine that we've seen this result. This just tells us that the natural infection follows the pattern we've seen for coronaviruses in general. Other coronaviruses do exactly the same thing. This one's following the sort of, or conforming to type. It's not necessarily a death sentence for the effectiveness of a vaccine.
And aware of the fact you have to go in a minute, final question, in simple, crude layman's terms, this means you can catch it twice.
Yep, and there are now a number of case reports. We think of there's about 22 people who've been documented around the world now as having been confirmed as having caught this virus more than once. I spoke actually to researchers in America who had their paper in The Lancet last week, where there was a young gentleman in his 20s. He caught coronavirus. He wasn't that unwell the first time round. He recovered 48 days later. He then tested again positive, and they were able to genetically sequence the virus the first time and the second time, match them up and show that one was definitely different to the other. So he caught it twice.
Is it a little bit like marriage? It's easier second time round? Or is it
no, because it definitely wasn't like marriage for him, because the second time round he was admitted to hospital and gravely unwell. He's recovered now, thank goodness. But other people, on the other hand, have caught it twice and didn't even know they had it the second time. So this is the virus that just keeps on giving. We just, it's an enigma. It's a real black box, this one.
Chris, look after yourself. Thank you. Always good speaking with Dr. Chris Smith, a broadcaster himself and consultant virologist at Cambridge University Hospital. I've got the privilege of bringing in to the conversation now someone who's actually a lead author of the report that we've been discussing. Helen Ward is a Professor of Public Health at Imperial College London. Very grateful for your time. Privileged to be able to speak to you, Professor. Thank you, and credit to you and the work that you and your colleagues have done on this. At a snapshot of all the work that you've done, what do you think my listeners need to take from this report, given that the headlines are saying immunity lasts just a few months?
The key thing I think people need to take away from this is that even if you've had coronavirus, you really must not lower your guard, and we all need to work together to actually stop ourselves getting it again, but also to stop passing it on to others. So all of the measures actually should apply to everybody. Do wear a mask. Do wash your hands, do keep your space away from people where you possibly can. It's really important, and don't assume once you've had it that the rules don't apply to you.
It's a sizable chunk of work you and your colleagues have done, 365,000 people. Professor, does it break down in any areas regarding gender or age or any other criteria?
Yeah, well, I would first actually just like to say to people that are listening a huge thank you to everyone who's taken part. And there's a lot of people they've done the finger prick test themselves and they've told us the results, and we are really, really grateful. What we found over the 3 rounds of the study is that most people who were getting these antibodies did report some kind of infection, severe or mild, back in March and April. It was much more common in London, which I think we knew from hospitalisation figures, but it was right at the beginning we found about 12-13% of people in London had antibodies. That's fallen now to about 9%. It's more common in young, the 18 to 34-year-olds, than in older groups.
Right.
But the highest groups are in people who work in health and social care, in health care who work with patients, but also people who work in care homes, and people from black and minority ethnic groups.
Is that
There's
because
real
of exposure?
disparity.
Is that because of the level of exposure, Professor?
Yes, we think it is the level of exposure that, particularly for people, black and Asian groups, it's more likely in city areas with more dense housing and larger households. And those are people who do key worker jobs. They're more likely to work in those sectors where it's very difficult to work at home, as some of us have the privilege of doing. And so we think a lot of this is about increased exposure.
So in reality, when my listeners hear there's a vaccine has been discovered, should they think, oh gosh, I remember that professor on LBC a few months ago, I'm going to have to take it twice a year? Is that the truth of this?
No, and I caught the end of your last interview with Chris, and I think that vaccines work in a different way. They are designed specifically to induce immunity and hopefully longer lasting immunity. And so the ways that we're developing vaccines have different mechanisms now. And I think we're hopeful that one or more of them will produce a longer lasting immunity. But there are other vaccines where you do have to take them more than once. You have to have booster doses. So it wouldn't be the end of the world, but obviously we hope one that's going to last a little bit longer than 3 to 6 months.
Do you think we're close to a vaccine, Professor?
I'm not the best person to ask. I know that they're going.
You're a lot better than me.
I know
You're a lot
that
closer than I am.
We're in trials at the. People are in trials again. A lot of volunteers are taking these vaccines. So I think that the rate at which we have made discoveries of science this year, remembering that we didn't even know about this back until January, I think it's actually phenomenal. I mean, it's really hard for everybody, but there are vaccines in development. We can't, unfortunately, rush them through, but we are doing everything we can. And my colleagues who work in immunology and vaccinology are really getting on with that. So I am hopeful. I'm an optimist. I'm hopeful we will have one, but it's not going to be this side of Christmas, unfortunately.
No. Professor, privileged speaking with you. Thank you. And to you and all your colleagues who put that report together. You're a lead author of the report. Helen Ward is a Professor of Public Health at Imperial College London.
This is LBC.
This is LBC's Coronavirus podcast. Please subscribe to keep up to date for the latest news on the pandemic.